Hello, my name is Mick Fealty, and I'm hosting tonight the very first moot, or court of moot, or moot court, however you want to put it, for the national conversation. Give you a very brief idea of what it's all about, the National Conversation is a campaign that launched this morning at the RSA in London. It's running an event over the next 2 days in York. And the basic idea is to create a conversation which is sort of removed from the frothy atmosphere of Westminster, the competitive atmosphere of Westminster, and try to bring conversation out of that atmosphere and into something a little bit more ordinary. We're starting, or the National Conversation is picked as its first topic, Beveridge, and it is trying to take a sort of a calm and collected look at issues around welfare. It's the 70th anniversary of the first Beveridge report, published in 1942, and this is really just an opportunity to kind of to look at some of the issues facing welfare and the welfare state as we head into a period where there are much lower birth rates, lower numbers of taxpayers, and greater numbers of those who need the service as we become a kind of an aging population. I have tonight two guests. I also have somewhere out in the ether David Taylor, who is the convener of the National Conversation. He seemed to have kind of got kicked out of the moot just before we went live, but I'm sure he'll join us. There's one or two of you out there watching us live as well. And what I'd like to say is throw in your comments. You can do that on the Google Events page, which you'll see when you go to Google+, or you can pick that up from the National Conversation blog, or indeed Slugger O'Toole. But better for us, perhaps, as we're going live, to go directly to the YouTube page. There's a live commenting facility. That means you can ask questions of the panel as we're going through, or make your own points on things that you think perhaps that we're not covering quite so comprehensively. So first of all, I want to turn to the first of tonight's guests, John Lloyd. John Lloyd of the FT, and you're joining us from the Reuters Institute at Oxford, John.
Yeah.
It's one of the great things about this technology that we're using. People can come in from all over the place. John, just your own sort of brief thoughts on Beveridge and welfare reform and.
Well, first, the obvious is that it was a very different time 60 years ago, or rather 70 years ago. And when Beveridge began to think through what a welfare state would look like, then poverty, undernourishment, very bad housing, bad or no education was afflicted many in the population. In the course of the last 7 decades, in most of Europe, indeed all of Western Europe, and to a degree of Eastern Europe, which is the former communist countries, you have had a welfare state of differing kinds, but one which has raised most people out of dire poverty, provided social services, provided education, and in many cases provided decent housing. And that's been a huge achievement. It's been perhaps the most single social achievement, the largest single social achievement of European countries, and one which European countries can be rightly proud. The difficulty now, clearly, is just to say the obvious, is that in most of these states, the welfare state, as it's been developed, is no longer affordable at the levels in which it became, which it developed into. There are exceptions to that. The Scandinavian states, Germany to a degree, but many are, as you mentioned earlier, have demographic trends which are very negative in the way of providing for future generations welfare, and therefore all of them have to come to some kind of accommodation with their reduced circumstances. My argument would be that that has to be, and why I'm keen on this project, is that it should be, at least in part, owned by people at large, rather than this or that party in power. In other words, I think a reshaping of the welfare state and of social provision, which is essential, would have to be part of a very large and as democratic as possible conversation.
Great. Just to pick one of the points that you make there, and I think it's particularly useful, given the hate that's often generated around discussions of welfare, to look at one particularly extreme example in the European kind of states. In Italy, surprisingly, Catholic Italy, where the birth rate has been well below the replacement level for quite some time, I think we see there a kind of a situation that's even, well, a great deal more acute than anything that we're facing in the United Kingdom.
Demographically, certainly. It was a common view that Catholic states would have high birth rates, but actually Catholic states now have low birth rates, including Ireland, which had a very high birth rate, now has a very low one, or lowish one. And Italy has had a low birth rate for a long time. And I know Italy well. My wife is Italian, and it's quite clear when you go to many of the cities of Italy that the elderly are now, if not the majority, certainly very numerous. And one of the big growths of employment in Italy has been what are called the badanti, the people who are essentially servants of very elderly people, very often women who are alone. Italy had a somewhat skewed welfare state by British standards. That was, it put an awful lot of its social provision into pensions. And especially in the public sector, people were, and to some extent still can, retire as early as 50. Relatively young, obviously many of them had second jobs, but they got high pensions. And much of what has happened and is happening in Italy in the last 10, 15 years is an attempt to claw back that pension provision, which the Berlusconi governments did to an extent, the Prodi governments of the centre-left did to an extent, and now the Monti technocratic government is doing to a greater extent. And in future also, whatever government takes over from Monti, assuming any government does, because he seemed a bit reluctant, the same will be true, and the same will be true in other countries, that for politicians it's a very doleful inheritance in almost every European country. The political task is to try to adjust the welfare state. In Italy, it's to some extent more dramatic than others.
That's interesting, and I think there's some themes in there, John, that I'd really like to come back to. But I want to move across to Claire. Slightly wondering what's happened to David. David, hello. If you can get back in, we'd love to hear from you as soon as possible. Anyway, cutting across to Claire. Now, Claire Foster Gilbert, you're coming at this from a very different angle. And later in the moot, we're going to have some interesting, well, I hope we're going to have some interesting stuff. The videos that I took earlier on today haven't quite loaded as well as I would have liked. But you're coming at this really, or at least considering the kind of the total problem more from a theological angle. What sort of, just briefly, kind of what thoughts come to you on the subject of?
Well, I guess what I would say is that the welfare state was an expression of human decency, and that still matters enormously. I guess that the decency, it means we care about each other, and there's a cost to that. And recognizing that there's a cost to that, it's not just something to which we have a right, but it's something about which we all have a responsibility, or for which we all have a responsibility. And that's why John's point about it being something that we all have to take part in is so incredibly important, raising awareness of the the fact that this matters to all of us and we've all got to join in. I think the time may be different, but the issues are the same, particularly that of expressions of decency. I think people are decent, basically.
Okay. Well, one of the things about the old moot courts, and that they really date from the Anglo-Saxon times, particularly in England, and you can see them still, and so they're almost like there's one not far from me in Dorset, which is was an outdoor arena, very local, but part of our job is not to come to conclusions, but to turn over some what we might notionally call evidence before the okay okay, sorry, David's just contacted me through Google there. Yeah, so we don't have evidence as such, but we have a number of kind of angles that I think would be useful really to consider. One of the people that I spoke to earlier on today was Alex Massey. Many of you will know him as a columnist and blogger with the Spectator magazine. He sort of self-describes himself in his video as a journalist, a critic, and he points out that he's not currently writing a novel, which is a kind of a useful sort of piece of information to know. So what I'm going to do is, when I can work out all the technology on this, hopefully I can. Hold on. Very slick operation, as you can see. Once I've got the, I'm going to play this in the. Come on, Alex.
And the latter, Beveridge, when you consider.
I think it's useful to know that Alex is kind of speaking from the right on this, although I think most people would consider him to be on the moderate right. He sort of goes back and talks a little bit about the origins and how that's different from today. Some of the stuff that John's just kind of mentioned in a way, but puts an interesting sort of angle on it.
And the latter, Beveridge, when you consider the levels of deprivation, of squalor, of want, of poverty, Beveridge was it's truly horrific. And particularly, of course, in a time of war when society is mobilized to be fighting for something, to defeat a great evil, it became impossible, really, morally impossible, I think, to ignore the levels of deprivation on the home front. Failing to address that would in some ways constitute a defeat, not as serious perhaps as a failure to beat Nazism, but a defeat nonetheless. Now we have a situation where people who would previously have been considered quite well off, or at least comfortably off, are also part of the welfare state, recipients of government welfare. So the welfare state has expanded way beyond its original remit. And that brings us back to then the question of its sustainability. Pressures on social spending are only likely to increase over the coming decades. This isn't really a matter for next year, 2 years' time from now, or even 5 years' time from now. It's not actually a question about deficit reduction in the short term. It's much more about putting public finances on a sustainable path over the course of the next 20, 30, even 40 years. Because with an aging population, that brings enormous costs with it as well. Even if we mount a rigorous effort and successful effort at controlling the ever-increasing costs of healthcare, it does come across as that, and that's one of the difficulties with this whole discussion. One of the things that makes it very difficult to have an honest and open and fair-minded conversation about these issues, because it is much easier to impugn the good faith of your political opponents. But what I suppose I would say is that efforts of reforming welfare, and reforming welfare isn't just a case of spending less on welfare in the long term. Actually helping people into work, helping people lead fuller, more fulfilling, better lives for themselves, less dependent than others. It's something that might well, in individual cases, often cost quite a lot of money. But one of the ways of, if you don't reform the welfare system now, it will break eventually. And it will break eventually either because it simply becomes unaffordable, or because those who essentially who pay for it will revolt against it, and then the poor and the most needy really will be screwed. You know, that if you want to save the welfare state, you need to reform it.
Okay. Sorry for the slight false start on that one, but interesting points. And he sort of brings up this thing that you mentioned, Claire. This sort of almost like a moral imperative. This sense that you know, it was the morally right thing to do to set up the welfare state in the first place. I mean, to what extent is that sort of moral imperative now under contest?
Well, I don't think the moral imperative could ever go away. We need to look out for each other, and it seems to me that the conversations that we have are all about how we do it. I don't know. I don't know people who think it's fine to leave people who are really vulnerable or really sick or really in trouble just lying by the wayside. People don't wake up in the morning and think, you know, that's a really good thing to do, to ignore the needy. It's a question of how, and I suppose the sense that we've all got to contribute to that in some way or other, and that there's a fairness in the contribution, so it's not all give on one side and take on the other. That's what it boils down to. I do just want to say something about aging populations as well, though, that we are all concerned about that, and clearly the demographics are changing, but so are old people, I think, and there's a tremendous capacity in what we see as an aging population, which may turn out to be incredibly economically valuable and hugely contributory to society going forward, and including a welfare state going forward. I'm not quite so worried about the aging population as others, perhaps.
That's an interesting point. And in a sense, John, this is what many of the critics on the right criticize the welfare state, because it induces a certain degree of social passivity, a sense that the dispossessed in this world, whether they be, you know, the aged who are hugely dependent in their later years on health services that struggle to provide the answers that they need, or indeed jobless, sometimes down through different generations.
I think that's right, Michael. I very much agree with Claire. I don't think there's very many people, with the possible exception of Mitt Romney in certain moods, or at least before certain audiences, that would say that he doesn't really, that they don't care, they don't give a damn about people being destitute. I think there are, to make a more clear division than there is in practice, I think there is there's the European welfare model, or models, which is for a fairly, certainly compared to the past, relatively comprehensive welfare state, which attacks Beveridge's 5 evils, or even keeps them at bay.
Just remind us of those 5 evils, John.
That was
poverty.
Frightened you might say that. One was ignorance, squalor, want, ignorance, squalor, want. Well, we got 3 or 5. That's not too bad. What?
Ignorance.
Yeah, I said ignorance. Ignorance, squalor, and want.
Sorry.
And anyway, we should look it up before we bandy these words around. But the welfare state does keep these, and has kept these away at bay, or at least much lower than they otherwise would have been. The other one is, if you like, the American, or especially the American right, but also to an extent the American, which is to say that you should have some kind of safety net, but it's fairly minimal. And more important is that people, through churches, through charitable organization, through individual conscience, should look after each other. And that's a truer community than one which is created through the tax system. And actually, of course, all, certainly of the Western societies, partake of both. And it's a question of degree. As far as as the passivity point that you made, Mick, I think that welfare states can address that. I mean, it's a real point, a real problem. And clearly it causes a good deal of anxiety and anger, especially among people who themselves are not well off. I mean, the people who most criticize those who are seen as welfare scroungers are the people who live on the same estates or next door to them and who work. It's less of an anxiety for people who are in middle or upper middle class. So it's a real problem. But welfare states can and do attempt to deal with that. Again, the Scandinavian states, especially Sweden and Norway and Finland, all have quite strict criteria, stricter than most which we have had, certainly in the past, and other countries have had, as to who gets welfare and when and how long it lasts. And the Swedes especially are very strict about people getting jobless help being put back into work. After a while, it simply stops the welfare payments. And they've also been they've done experiments in the so-called free schools, much more extensively than we have until this present government. So quite comprehensive welfare states can and do deal with the easy rider or the passive problem, and sometimes quite strictly. I think it does, however, depend upon a view that society, or most people in society, have, that this is the right thing to do, that people, as Claire was arguing before, have a responsibility as well as an expectation of assistance at hard times.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. When we went through all of the five perils, we got ignorance, we got squalor, we got want, disease was one of them, and the other one was idleness. So it's interesting in a sense. I'm going to try and play something from John Bew, the historian, but I don't think it's uploaded properly to my machine yet. So I'm going to kind of save that one for a little bit later on, perhaps. But one of our contributors, or one of the people who are watching and putting comments in, is a guy called Nigel Eccleston, who points to the fact that actually, and this relates somewhat to the point that John has just made about some of the northern countries being tougher on welfare, and this is essentially a critique from the left, that actually what we have is huge inequalities in society, and that it's a kind of a wide, the gap between the dispossessed and those who have money is kind of exacerbating a certain kind of standoff between the classes and the underclass. I wonder what we think about that. David Taylor has finally joined us. Hi, David. You can.
That's a few technical problems, my answer.
David, I just want to throw that one at you. What's your sense of this sort of yawning gap that's growing between the haves and the have-nots, and that being, the gap between work and worklessness, getting wider, even though the Blair government, told us at the time that they were doing a lot of work on this.
Well, I know that John started off talking about the absolute material poverty that welfare states were set up to combat immediately after World War II. And I think, yes, there is still a yawning gap between haves and have-nots, and I think this is perhaps a banal point, or one that's been made a lot, but it's one of aspiration, isn't it? Today, I generally don't think many people are going hungry, or poor in a sense that people in 1945 or 47 would have understood.
Yeah. So want is you're suggesting that want has been comprehensively ticked off the list?
Possibly, but but decency, if it's Claire's point, hasn't. And I think we can still be, I am, or many people are still exercised by that gap between haves and have-nots, even if it's no longer, even if it's more complex today than it might have been seemed in 1945, say.
Well, isn't there also something that we've understood about people's happiness relating to the size of difference between not the haves and the have-nots, but the haves more and the haves lesses, and which is, it's not so much aspiration as contrast or comparison.
Well, that's a funny thing. When these systems were set up, sort of paradoxically, they were set up on a very materialistic basis, to deal with material inequalities. And now, but we're social animals, and now the inequalities are not material. The important inequalities, they're about something else. And I think this a system designed in an era of Taylorian production lines and concern about output of pig iron and tractors and stuff, is not really quite up to the task of dealing with inequality today. And that's why we need to have these conversations.
Okay, here's another contribution, and I suspect it's coming in from the left as well. Fred Garnett on Google Plus it quotes Daniel Dorling's book called Injustice, and on why social inequality persists. And he takes the 5 social evils that Beveridge identified and suggests that these have he suggests some modern kind of versions. So this will be interesting. I'm not. I mean, people can comment on this, but I kind of want to move on from this section after I quoted Fred. But if you want to comment, fine. So he's suggesting there's a shift from ignorance to elitism, from want to exclusion, from idleness to prejudice, from squalor to greed, from disease to despair. Now, certainly people want to comment on that. I wouldn't mind hearing again from Fred, just to kind of extrapolate a little bit further on that, perhaps later in the program. Anyone want to comment on that suggested shift from Dorling?
I mean, I think it's interesting. One thing I would pick up on it. I think that prejudice, certainly in sexual prejudice, racial prejudice, is probably less in most states. And it's not just a matter of political correctness. I think it's no longer, I think many people now no longer have the kind of reaction to minorities or that was the case, say, 30 or more years ago. So I think prejudice is probably down. What you have got clearly is, and whether or not exclusion is now worse. I mean, these things have to be tested, but it certainly is the case that within countries, especially, well, in many countries, in the United States, in Western Europe, above all in Russia, in China now and India, you've got now a huge gulf between the extremely rich multi-billionaires and the extremely poor. Actually, in world terms, there has been something of a narrowing of the extremes. That's not to say, of course, that they're not very poor and they're very rich, but actually they're a little closer together than they were, in large part because poverty in China and India has been lessened, especially in China and other countries as well, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. So that when you've lifted people out of absolute poverty, or indeed even poverty into, you might call, in their terms, relative affluence, then you affect the wide divergence of the very rich and the very poor. But whether or not that means that the very rich are now more exclusive than the rich, titled, the upper middle class were in societies like the Victorian one, or indeed, for that matter, the early 20th century ones, where there was a greater sense in many societies, including this one, the British one, that to belong to a certain class gave you privileges, and that others had to recognize that. Lower classes had to recognize the privileges. Many of the lower classes were directly serving the upper classes. And therefore there was that sense in society. I think one would have to examine it closely to see if that were the case. I think there was a greater, at least, social egalitarianism, which was not translated into what I call material egalitarianism. But some of that has been good.
That's a great point. Just on that last thing, could you just pull it out a little bit further? This idea that social egalitarianism is kind of not working out in the way that you expected. And it's just a point that David's sort of made in the background here, that and it's been an early criticism, I think, of particularly the NHS, that its bureaucratic nature has made it somewhat insensate or insensible to kind of serving, and quantifying real need.
My experience of the NHS is not that, but then everyone says that. Many people have a good experience of the NHS and then assume that bureaucracy is, as it were, not in their doctor's surgery or not in their hospital. I also think that, again, these things do require close examination and research and so on, but I doubt if the National Health Service is worse at identifying need than it was 60, 70 years ago when it was begun. I'd be surprised if that was the case. It clearly is more bureaucratic in the simple sense that there's an awful lot more need for administrators and so on, but I doubt very much if it's actually less efficient, in spite of what the Daily Mail and others would say about it.
Yes, I think aren't the questions for the NHS more to do with the cost of new medicines, the availability of high-tech medicine which wasn't available 40 years ago, and the really, really difficult decisions that might have to be made about choosing not to give someone a treatment which does exist, perhaps in the last 6 months of their life. I mean, there are some horrific statistics about the amount of money that's spent on treatment in the last 6 months of people's lives, and we might want to take a look at that. But they would be hard decisions to make, because refusing treatment at any level is a hard thing to do.
I think that's right. I think also that what has happened, I think this is anecdotal and to some extent memory, that because people are more aware, people at every level of society are more aware of their rights and pushier about them, then the assumption that the doctor or the matron or the nurse was always right is no longer viable. That people ask and demand more, and that can mean a lot of friction and often can be unfair to doctors and nurses and so on, but it is more democratic. And
yes, and I think that can work in a different way, in that people can say, you know what, I don't want to be treated. You might think this is going to save my life, but I'd rather not have the chemotherapy or not have the whatever drugs. I'd rather just quietly come to an end without endless expensive treatment. They might.
Okay. David, did you want to add anything there before we move on?
Well, I just with perhaps, although the NHS is slightly out of scope when we're talking about Beveridge, it is illustrative of how much society has changed and how much our expectations have moved on. I mean, before I came on here, I was writing something for one of my customers at BT about just about what manufacturers have to deal with now in terms of meeting customer expectations, in terms of getting a very individualized service and getting it today and to their specifications, etc. And we transfer those expectations of consumer goods, etc., or services into state services. And it's not clear that the state is equipped to deal with those, or B, that it can deal with them and be true to the principle of fairness?
I really agree, and I think if there's one word that's inappropriate for our relationship to the welfare state, is that we should not think of ourselves as consumers in relation to it. We are not consumers. We are participants. We are sometimes recipients, sometimes giving. But consumer is, well, it's the wrong word for a human being in the first place, frankly, but certainly not in relation to this.
Okay. Look, I just want to take a quick... Yes?
I'm sorry. I have to go and get a train.
Okay, John. Listen, thanks.
I'll get back to my family.
Yeah, okay.
So, but my apologies for that. I've enjoyed it, and I will again, I hope.
Okay, good man. Thanks, John.
Sorry.
Okay, well, we won't be too much longer now. In fact, after John's gone, I just want to play this a very brief excerpt, and it sort of pays into some of the things that we've heard people talking about here. It's an extract from an item on Newsnight. It was recorded last year by James Purnell, a kind of thought to be on the Blairite wing of the Labour Party in government, and it's his reflections just after government. I think it's often a really interesting time to hear from someone just after they pulled out of politics and they have some time to kind of ruminate on the lessons learned, particularly in the case of James Purnell, who has temporarily perhaps left politics for now. But it's a particularly penetrating piece of analysis, I think, coming from someone on the left.
When I was the cabinet minister, we spent more money on welfare because we wanted to reduce poverty. It was one of the things that everybody in the Labour government agreed about. But when it came to the last election, one of the reasons that we lost was that traditional Labour supporters no longer backed the welfare state.
When he was in his teens.
Remember this famous encounter? Everyone focused on the discussion about immigration, but it's actually what came before that's so revealing.
Changing things, what I was drummed in.
Whilst I've been away, you've had a great conversation, but I've missed it, and I suspect also the greater public has also missed it, because unless I'm in the hangout, we're not broadcasting, so I apologise.
We solved basically all of the problems.
We did it!
Okay, good.
So
I
what
think
happens?
I'll go home then. That's it. If you could just, if the two of you could just briefly summarise, because I think we ought to try and bring this first moot, experimental as you can obviously tell it is, to a close. So if we could just kind of.
Okay, so we were
Claire,
talking
I
about
come to
the
you.
importance of decency again, the importance of trust, the inappropriateness of the word consumer. David can say more about this, but the relationship that you perhaps cease to have when an entity becomes so big that you can't relate to it in any way. I don't know if people saw the clip, but I really, really like the use of the word covenant in that clip, because covenant implies a mutual relationship. Those are some of the things we talked about, but David can say more perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, no, absolutely. My point was really, do we want, in order to have the relationships between individuals and the state, do we go back to a contributory principle, like national insurance was originally conceived? And with that comes some uncomfortable conversations about having, as I say, having two queues at the dole office. You know, one for the insured people who've paid their stamp, and one for people on national assistance, which I understand had a kind of stigma attached to it, and in the end was really too uncomfortable a state for our society to maintain when it could afford to kind of paper over these differences. I don't think it can anymore.
Okay, good. I was just fascinated by the. This is just something by way of really kind of topping out a little bit, and I think to give Claire something to bowl, something clear to bowl at too. You say all of that. That is uncomfortable. But the truth is that Beveridge as a character was an interesting character in himself. John View, the interview that I did with him earlier on, points out that his report was something that neither Labour nor the Conservatives were comfortable with. It created difficulties on both sides. The union tradition very unhappy about the sense of where workers' rights would be within this. And also, in a sense, the state was at a particular point, with midpoint in the war, if you like, where it was almost ubiquitous, that it had a central role for kind of convening resources in a way that created the kind of maximal effect. In a sense, exactly the role that people suggest that the market can play in terms of, in these days, in a more pluralist world, where the market is actually said to be very good at kind of assigning resources to the right places. But also, View points out that Beveridge himself and the generation with whom his ideas caught fire was a generation whose parents had suffered, often fathers killed in the First World War. You had the kind of ups and downs of the 20s, then very much the kind of the long depression of the of the 1930s, and then a kind of a moral purpose, a sense that this thing could not go on. And the thing that they were talking about was not the war so much as the long experience of poverty, the grinding, the sense that the national insurance brought about and crystallized by Lloyd George was something that needed to be really racked up and geared. And it's interesting in a sense that he simply went over the heads of the politicians and came up with a document that was so damn popular that the politicians couldn't say yes. And I'm just wondering, where do we get the imperative to go cross-party on this? Because in a sense, if one side or the other simply get their way and either turn the clock back or, wind it, look at redistribution of incomes, it's not going to go anywhere. Somehow, the big picture needs to be grabbed, and there has to be something about that big picture that kind of addresses that public imagination, and it's not clear to me what that is.
No, and I sense there's a narrative we're grasping after here which will capture all our imaginations and be utterly compelling, that does speak to human decency and our trust in our wish to trust in each other, and frankly our wish to contribute. I think that if we could find that narrative, it would be compelling, and it would be echoing outside the Westminster Village. Well,
it's interesting too, Claire, on that point, that Beveridge basically didn't want to tinker around with the system. He wanted to defenestrate the system and say, this is simply not working. We need a revolution. This has got to be something completely different. And it was that sense that this was and it goes back to something that Alex says too, in the sense that if we don't fix it, it may not be broke on Tuesday week. But, 10, 15, 20, 30 years' time, we're going to get to the point where people are just going to put their hands in their pockets and find there's just simply not enough there to pay for the increasing demand.
So are you saying a narrative, a story that's utterly different from the welfare state, rather than trying to mend the welfare state or make it fit for purpose or ready for the 21st century?
If it's to be a Beveridge type move, then in a sense aren't we talking about something that's radical?
You know what, I really, really hope we are, and not least because of my work in environmental ethics and what's happening to the planet. I don't think we're going to be able to ignore that for much longer. There are some big questions coming up which we will have to address together. It's no good. It won't be any good looking for one hero to save us all. We all have to be the hero of our own life, of our own. Take responsibility for being heroes. All of us together. There's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I think we do need something radical and new and compelling and irresistible and, simple.
David, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely, we do, but I also don't want a crisis to force us to take it, like a 1930s depression or a world war, to forge that sense of commonality. And I talked earlier about consumer choice and how difficult that makes life for people in the private sector trying to meet that. Even harder for government trying to deal with it, and to forge a sense of solidarity in a society where everyone is now or appears to be behaving more and more in an atomized, selfish kind of way. Sorry, that's not a jolly thing to end on, but
let's not quite end it there, because again, I had a great interview with Douglas Murray earlier on. Hello. Oh, Claire. We're losing this mood rapidly. Maybe we ought to leave it there. Oh, you still there, Claire?
I am. Yeah, I am.
Right. Okay, I think you've gone.
You're breaking up a bit, but
I'm here. Well, it's getting late. It's getting late.
I just noticed no one said big society. That clearly didn't do it. That didn't capture us.
I was going to say big society.
Well, we both said it.
No, I think that's interesting. The point of not waiting for crisis. I mean, that implies that what we need is something that is kind of visionary, that carries the communality. But something Douglas Murray said earlier on when I interviewed him at the launch was interesting, and I want to throw this at you, Claire, as a theologian. And it's a claim that he's made several times before, but you'll be able to see it on the on the blog and various other places, where he says that the problem of the welfare state is that in a secular Britain, the welfare state is the new deity. It's this makes it problematic in terms of actually approaching trying to fix something, because if something is a deity, it is by definition infallible and unimprovable. And I just wondered if you had any kind of reflections on that.
Yeah, well, that's clearly nonsense. I mean that something that humans created could be infallible and unchangeable. Of course, it's nonsense, but you can see how it might happen, and you know what? With or without faith, that could still happen. God, the God the Father, or Mother Earth feeding us and taking care of us, and so we don't have to grow up and look after ourselves. I mean, religion can be infantilizing, and so I guess can a welfare state.
Great. Okay, we've lost David. I don't know where he's gone, but that's well, we've lost everybody tonight at some point, except you, Claire. I think you managed to stay in for the whole shebang. So, rather, let's bring this to an end and say thanks, Claire, for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thanks, David. Okay,
thank you,
thanks to John Lloyd also for his insight, and we'll convene again this time next week, and when we'll get some kind of report back from the proceedings at York, where they're doing all kinds of interesting things. David, do you want to give us a quick kind of resume of what's happening tomorrow and Thursday?
Well, tomorrow we'll be using, we're getting about 20 people together to play with a thing called Lego, serious play, to use that to express how they feel about political concepts and fairness and the future of welfare, which we're expecting to be good. I hope so. And then Thursday, Claire Fox is hosting the York Conversation in York, which will be a more traditional format, face-to-face conversation about these topics with about 30 to 35 people.
Yeah, no, that's good. And then Claire was on fire this morning, actually, and talking about how very often these exercises claim they're about conversation, but when they look for funding, the funders often want to know the outcome of the conversation before it actually happens. And I think some of the stuff I like about the York thing, particularly the Lego stuff, is that it is looking for some kind of creative breakthrough on some of this stuff. Not necessarily whole answers, but maybe some indications as to ways forward. So,
okay.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye, Claire.
Bye.
Bye, David.
Bye.
and we'll see some of you next week. All the best. Now there's an embarrassed silence while I try and locate the off button.